I've been fascinated by anamorphic lenses for years, but every time I seriously considered adding one to my kit, I ran into the same problems. They're expensive, heavy, usually manual focus only, and as someone who shoots most projects by myself, they just never really fit into the way I work. So when SIRUI reached out and asked me to try their new Astra 50mm full-frame autofocus anamorphic cine lens, I was genuinely curious. On paper it promises exactly what many of us always wanted. A full-frame anamorphic lens with autofocus that's actually designed around the workflow of solo creators. So in this video I want to show you the kind of image this lens can produce, walk you through the features that actually matter in real-world use, and help you decide whether it's a piece of gear worth adding to your own kit. To understand why I think this lens is so interesting, it helps to first understand what anamorphic actually is. Most people instantly recognize the movie look, but rarely stop to think about what creates it. And what's funny is that most modern camera lenses have spent years chasing technical perfection. More sharpness, less glare, cleaner optics, and fewer distortions. Yet many of the films we've grown up watching were shot on lenses with very obvious imperfections. Over time we've subconsciously started associating those imperfections with cinema. One of the biggest reasons for that is anamorphic lenses. Unlike spherical lenses we find in most cameras, anamorphic lenses use oval optical elements to squeeze more horizontal information onto the same camera sensor. Once you de-squeeze that footage in editing, you end up with a native widescreen image roughly 2.35:1 or simply 21:9. But the wider aspect ratio is only part of the story. Anamorphic lenses also produce subtle barrel or pincushion distortion, softer edges, slight vignetting, oval bokeh, and those iconic horizontal lens flares. None of these are technically perfect, but together they've become part of what we instinctively recognize as the cinema look. Now, I've actually made videos showing how to recreate this look in post, and you can get somewhat close, but it's never the same. Adding black bars simply crops away part of your image, and characteristics like distortion, bokeh, flares, and the way the lens interacts with light all come from the lenses themselves. These things are basically impossible to perfectly add to your footage after you shot it. On top of that, you're adding extra work to every single clip instead of just capturing the look in camera. But so if anamorphic lenses look so good, why hasn't everyone been using them? For the past centuries, they've been expensive, heavy, and almost always manual focus. On larger productions that's less of an issue, because there's usually a dedicated focus puller whose only job is to keep the subject sharp. I've tried doing it on shoots before, and it's incredibly difficult, especially once your subject starts moving while you're also operating the camera. This is basically impossible. For solo creators, this was therefore basically not an option at all, because it meant juggling framing, exposure, movement, storytelling, and focus at the same time. In other words, you often had to choose between the cinematic character of an anamorphic lens and the convenience of autofocus. And to be honest, autofocus is one of the best features when filming alone. So naturally the next question is whether there's actually a lens that solves those problems. That's why I left my editing cave for a bit and simply went out to have some fun shooting with this lens. And after using it for a while now, the biggest game changer is definitely the autofocus I mentioned before. But besides it, there are also some other cool features. First off, I really appreciate that this one is a full-frame anamorphic lens. Unlike many other options that are limited to APS-C, this one covers the full sensor on cameras like my Sony a7 IV or the Sony ZV-E1. Combined with its 1.33 optical squeeze, you end up with a very wide cinematic image while making full use of your sensor. It's also surprisingly compact. The 50mm weighs around 620 grams, the 75mm around 650 grams, and even the 100mm only comes in at around 700 grams. I mean, you may still consider that heavy for a prime lens, but you have to keep in mind for a cine anamorphic lens that's fairly lightweight. And that means you can comfortably use them on normal gimbals instead of needing massive cinema rigs. Personally, I've been using it on my DJI 3 Mini without any problem. And normally this one can't handle that much weight. Then there's also the price. At around 849 USD, it may still be an investment, but it's dramatically more approachable than traditional anamorphic cinema lenses. SIRUI also designed it as a complete lens lineup rather than just one single lens. It's available in Sony E, Nikon Z, and Leica L mounts. And every focal length shares a very similar design, including the same 67mm filter thread and identical gear positions. That means swapping lenses is much quicker because your rig stays exactly the way it is. That also means you just have to carry around one set of filters. Now, taking a closer look at the lens itself, you will notice it uses a T-stop rather than an f-stop. You can think of them in a very similar way, but while an f-stop measures the size of the aperture, a T-stop measures the actual amount of light passing through the lens. So if every lens in your lineup is rated at T1.8 for example, your exposure stays much more consistent when switching between focal length. The focus ring itself feels really smooth. It's marked in both meters and feet, and it's compatible with traditional follow focus systems as well as lighter focusing systems if that's part of your workflow. Right below that you'll find the AF/MF switch, making it easy to jump between autofocus and manual focus whenever you need to. There's also a customizable FN button. The iris lock is another nice touch. You can either control the aperture directly on the lens or rotate the ring to A. This way you can control aperture on the camera itself. Activating the iris lock then keeps you in the position A. This simply prevents you from accidentally knocking the aperture ring out of that auto position while you're shooting. Right next to that is the click on and off switch. With click enabled, the aperture ring has tactical stops between aperture values. Turn it off and it rotates completely smoothly, making exposure changes during video much more natural and also silent. And lastly, the minimum focus distance comes in at around half a meter or about 1.64 feet. So overall it's really nicely built and there's a lot of things that you can do with the lens. Now I also like to share some tips on using this lens and how to edit its footage and some tricks I picked up along the way. If you've never used an anamorphic lens before, the first thing that you will notice is that the image on your camera screen looks a little bit strange. Because as I mentioned, the lens records with a constant 1.33 optical squeeze. Everything appears compressed horizontally. There are a couple of different ways that you can work around that while you're filming though. The simplest option, especially as a solo shooter, is honestly just getting used to composing with the squeezed image. After a while it becomes surprisingly natural. Another option is using an external monitor, because many of them let you enable a 1.33 de-squeeze preview so you can see the image exactly as it will look like in the final edit. Some new cameras also have built-in de-squeeze functionality, although depending on the camera there can still be workflow limitations. Personally, my favorite solution is just using my phone as an external monitor. I mean, I have it with me either way, so I can also just use it as a display on my camera using a clip mount for that. There's an app I like to use, Monitor Plus, but there are also probably other out there that allow you to connect to your camera and de-squeeze the preview right away. I often use it as a remote monitor to set focus on myself from a distance or as a client monitor on shoots. And once you've captured your footage, the editing process is actually pretty straightforward. I'm using DaVinci Resolve, but the overall workflow is similar in most editing softwares. You can either create a native 20:9 timeline right away from the start, or edit inside a standard 16:9 timeline if that's your preferred workflow. After dragging in your footage, open your clip attributes by either right-clicking on the clip or just pressing P. Then go to the pixel aspect ratio and set it to 1.33 anamorphic. After de-squeezing your footage, you will end up with a very wide cinematic aspect ratio. In a 16:9 timeline, you will then end up with letterboxes, these black bars. If you want to avoid that, just edit in an aspect ratio of your timeline that matches your camera lens. Platforms like YouTube, for example, preserve the widescreen format, so it's actually kind of cool to see that if you're not in full screen, you can still see the very wide aspect ratio without these black bars appearing. So what do I actually think of this lens? I'm a big fan of the Anamorphic Look, so naturally I've been really enjoying shooting with the SIRUI Astra. That said, it's not perfect. It's still a little bit heavier than what I would choose as an everyday lens. And personally I would have loved the bokeh to be a little bit more oval shaped. But honestly, those are pretty small trade-offs when you look at what you're getting. This is a freaking full-frame anamorphic lens with autofocus. It feels incredibly well built and the image it produces just looks stunning. For me, that's really what makes this lens so interesting. It's not just the anamorphic look itself, it's that it removes many of the compromises that traditionally came with shooting anamorphic, making it a much more realistic option for solo creators. With that being said, if you'd like to learn more or check out the SIRUI Astra anamorphic lens series for yourself, I've left some more information in the description below. As always, thank you so much for watching until the very end, and I will catch you in the next one.